Hi there. I've been thinking. As is true with most of the world, Australian culture is very influenced by American culture. It's hardly surprising, we're exposed to it all the time. But there's one way, at least one way, in which Australian culture has chosen not to follow the American path, and that's the way of religion. I'm going to throw up some statistics for you. I know they can be a bit tedious, but I'll throw them up and have a little bit of a chat about them. These are figures taken from census data. The last census in Australia was in 2021 and before that in 2016. As you can see, in Australia in 2021, only 44% of people identified themselves as Christian, which was down from 52% 5 years before that. On the other hand, 39% said they had no religion, compared with 30%, and 10% identified themselves as other, compared with 8%. In the USA, the census data here is 10 years apart. In 2020, 70% identified themselves as Christian, which was down somewhat from 75%, but still much, much higher than that in Australia. 23% defined themselves as unaffiliated, up from 19%, but still far lower than in Australia. And around 5%, 6% identified themselves as other. Now, clearly, there's quite a difference on this issue between Australia and the United States. Of course, these figures are only really surface figures and they don't tell the full story. I can really only speak for Australia, but when people in Australia identify themselves as Christian or as affiliated with a particular Christian denomination, that doesn't often mean very much more than that they perhaps were baptized in the church when they were a baby and have some vague belief in God. They probably know very little about the Christian faith. They know very little about their particular denomination. They probably don't pray. They probably never read the Bible. Now, in a previous life of mine, many years ago, I actually used to work as an Anglican chaplain in a very large hospital. For those of you in the USA, Anglican equals Episcopalian. And every morning, I used to get a printout of all those people who had identified themselves upon admission to the hospital as Anglican, or more likely, Church of England. People hadn't become used to the change between those two usages. So I used to go around to the wards and visit these people. And I would say that probably as many as 90% of those who identified themselves as Church of England or Anglican hadn't been to church for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They didn't even know, many of them, most of them actually, that the Anglican Church had become the Anglican Church and was no longer called the Church of England. And I think that's true of probably the other major denominations, the major Christian denominations, the established Christian denominations in Australia, that many of them have little more than a nominal affiliation with that religion and no real commitment to it. As far as they're concerned, if they have some vague belief in God and they're good people, that makes them a Christian. And they don't consider issues of doctrine or faith, and it plays no real part in their daily lives. On the other hand, many of those who identify themselves as having no religion would probably still identify themselves as believing in some kind of God or spiritual being. But again, it probably wouldn't have any big impact on their lives. They wouldn't be praying, they wouldn't be invoking God, they wouldn't be reading the Bible, they wouldn't understand much about what any of the religious faiths actually teach. They just have this vague sense that there's, something more, not much more than that. Now, I don't know what the situation is in the USA, of course. And I suspect that these days it's probably changed a little bit in Australia too. I think probably the people who still identify themselves as Christian these days may be more likely to belong to a church than they would have in the past. That's probably true of younger people. I think among older people, still they might just automatically put down Anglican, Catholic, Baptist, Methodist, whatever it might be. Among those who identify with the newer, younger Christian denominations, their commitment is probably more strong and they probably have more of a lived out faith in their daily lives, if you like. Now, I think in general in Australia, people are uncomfortable with overt expressions of religion. They'd rather keep it to themselves and they'd rather other people kept it to themselves as also. And this is nowhere more obvious than when we consider our political leaders. Now, over the last decade or so, I suppose, we've had a couple of prime ministers in Australia who had an expressed religious faith. One of them was a Roman Catholic and the other belonged to a Pentecostal denomination. And I don't think that was an advantage to either of them. If anything, it was a disadvantage. People worried that the religious beliefs of these leaders might be influencing the policy of the government. I think you can see how this is extremely different from the situation in the United States. I don't think a leader in the United States at any level could explicitly identify themselves as an atheist. They simply wouldn't have a chance in any election. And I think you end up with a rather ludicrous situation where anyone who would like to be president, for example, has to express a religious faith, even if they don't really have one. I think Americans would rather that their leaders lie to them, that they openly admit that they did not have a religious faith. And it seems to me that Americans generally want religious beliefs to affect their political system, their legal system, the laws of the land, despite the fact that in the Constitution there's a separation of church and state. They still want religion to be a major influence in government. In Australia, we don't want that at all. I don't have any idea of the current religious affiliations of our Prime Minister, if any. And that's the way we like it. Now, as I indicated, I used to have a strong religious affiliation. In fact, I used to be an Anglican, Episcopalian minister. These days, I have no religious affiliation at all and no belief in God at all. And that's a topic that is probably going to come up time and time again in these videos. It's something that I always like to think about.